The University of Kentucky testing its entire student body for COVID-19 before the campus reopens later this month. It is an enormous undertaking that has already started. NBC News correspondent Ellison Barber joining me now from Lexington, Kentucky. Ellison, we're talking about some 30,000 students here. How is the school managing to test all of them?
Yeah, it is a heavy lift. They are doing this over the next 2 weeks. This is the first day of that testing. It will go all the way through August 22nd. Classes start for the fall semester on August 17th. Where we are right now is one of 5 testing sites they have. You can see this right here. They've turned the parking lot outside of their football arena into a drive-up testing site. Students, many of them who live off campus, are coming through here to get their COVID test. You can see if we look a little this way, they give each student who comes up their own tube, their own vial, and they explain them sort of the process is going to be. They'll come up, they will get a nasal swab. They hold on to that tube, that vial. You can see one happening here right now. 5 seconds on each side. It takes about 2 minutes, this entire process, once the students drive in and come in. And then they take that swab and they put it into the vial. You can see the student is holding the vial. They say that's to try and make sure that they don't accidentally cause any sort of cross-contamination. They're testing at least 1,500 students today. Again, this is one of 5 sites. Another thing they get, though, when students come here is this wellness kit. They are giving every single student coming on campus a kit. They gave us this one so that we can show you that has alcohol wipes in it. Let's see what else we got. Thermometers for each student, hand sanitizer, as well as 2 different face masks. Face masks are mandatory for students on campus. Again, they are all getting tested. It is required any student who is coming on campus, taking any course on campus, that they have a COVID-19 test before courses begin. They have 2 weeks to get it done. A lot of students choosing to take advantage of it and start doing it right now, especially those who live off of campus. Allison?
Ellison, you spoke with the university president. What did he tell you?
Yeah, you know, we asked him about why this is worth the risk, having so many students come back to class. They are not really doing a split. People can take online courses, but they do say that the majority of the fall semester will be in person, in class learning. He said that they know this is not without risk, but they are doing everything they can to mitigate those risks and reduce those risks. They feel like it is important for students to be on campus learning this way, but they say they will adapt as the science comes in, as they get results from massive tests like this and see what they need to do moving ahead. Here's a little more of what he told us.
This virus can hitchhike across the world in hours. It could hitchhike across a campus in minutes. So you have got to have effective screening, testing, and tracing to successfully keep people healthy. We must remain flexible. If better science comes out, we need to be able to put it immediately in the field.
They've turned one of their old, faculty sort of gathering places into a COVID command center. We went inside that and we're able to see a little bit of it earlier today. They have people set up kind of manning these results as they get the initial tests coming in. Most of these tests, according to the medical healthcare professionals that are giving them, they'll come back. The results will come back within 24, 48 hours at the latest. In that COVID command center, then there are staff contact tracers at the University of Kentucky who will go through any possible positive test and start tracing it out to see what other students or staff may have been in contact with a positive individual, and then make sure that that student is isolating, getting telehealth, or taking whatever necessary steps that they think they need to take if they have a positive test result. Allison?
Ellison, how about the students? How do they feel about coming back to campus?
Most of the students that we've talked to today, they say they feel mostly good about it. They feel like the school is taking all of the necessary steps to keep them safe, but some say that there's a lot of personal responsibility here, and sometimes other students, they could be careless, even though masks are required. Some students have said they're worried that maybe not everyone will adhere to them as closely as they should with those rules. One student we spoke to earlier this morning made that point. Listen here.
They're going to try to keep us safe, but I also know that college students enjoy their freedom, especially even more so after being cooped up for the past several months. And I'm worried that people are going to let their newfound freedom overtake their sense of keeping people safe.
I think that there are going to be some students that don't want to comply, but I do think that UK has a lot of different measures in place to make sure students are wearing their mask inside and outside and staying socially distant.
So most of the classrooms have been completely rearranged to allow for social distancing in the cafeteria. The tables are gone. Students can come in and pick up their food. They have to stand on circles, kind of spacing them out more. As I said, this is one of 5 testing sites. They started today. By the end of this, the university says they expect to test roughly 30,000 students. Allison?
All right, Ellison Barber at the University of Kentucky, where they are really undergoing a massive undertaking. Thank you so much for showing us how it all works.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.